There are moments in life that seem so small. A glance, a question, a simple act. Yet it is often these small things that end up changing a person entirely. And on a scorching summer afternoon in Kentucky, a 13-year-old boy with worn-out shoes and a faded shirt made a 78-year-old billionaire rethink his entire life. Matthew Evans, a wealthy man who once ran one of the largest financial corporations on the East Coast, sat silently in his silver Mercedes, by the side of a deserted road. His phone had no signal. The sun was blistering hot. And his rear right tire had gone completely flat without him even realizing it. He had once commanded hundreds of people, closed billion-dollar deals. But that day, he was nothing more than an old man helpless, waiting for a miracle. And that miracle did come. But not in the form he had ever known before. What you're about to hear is a true story. An emotional journey that flows in reverse. From numbness to connection. From wealth to humanity. You'll come to understand why a flat tire became a turning point in a man's life. Why a small act of kindness could spark a great dream. And why the most valuable thing is not what we have but how we live. Direct hit in this video, you'll join me as we explore a chance encounter between two opposite worlds. The life behind a country boy's quiet smile. And the subtle yet profound transformation of a man who seemingly had it all. But before we begin, ask yourself. When someone helps you not because they need something, but because they see that you do. Do you ever forget that? If your answer is no, then you'll understand why this story deserves to be told. Let's begin. That day in Kentucky was so hot, even the asphalt was starting to soften in the sun. Matthew Evans, a man well into his 70s, silver-haired, sharply dressed in a tailored suit, sat in his gleaming silver Mercedes, parked on a quiet country road. One hand rested on the steering wheel. The other tapped rhythmically on his phone. The screen flashed the familiar words, "No signal." The right rear tire had completely deflated. There were no repair shops. No gas stations. Not a single person around. As if, in a world overflowing with connection, he had landed in the one place completely cut off. Matthew had lived in penthouses. Negotiated million-dollar contracts. Operated in a system where everything moved according to his will. But now, all he had was silence. And a quiet sense of helplessness. Strangely enough, that very moment became the beginning of a journey that defied all the plans he had ever made. Not a business deal. Not a career opportunity. But a meeting simple, yet transformative. A boy, small, skinny, wearing a faded t-shirt and worn-out sneakers, appeared in the distance. He was walking. No backpack. No phone. But his expression was calm and strangely steady. He approached, looked down at the flat tire, then up at Matthew, and said, "Got a flat, sir?" His voice was calm, light, like it was no big deal. Matthew nodded. A little surprised. A little relieved. "Yes. I do. I tried calling for help, but there's no signal out here." The boy smiled, nodded, like he'd seen this a dozen times before. "I can help with that." And without waiting for another word, he got to work. He pulled a toolkit from the trunk, removed the flat tire, replaced it. Each movement swift and precise, like a young mechanic with real skill. He said simply, "My grandpa taught me last summer." And then got right back to work. There are things in life money can't buy. A home-cooked meal when you're hungry. A hug when your mind is in chaos. And an unknown boy helping you on a country road, asking nothing in return. When the new tire was in place, the boy simply said, "All done." No praise needed. No thanks expected. Just like that, he stood up and brushed off his hands. Matthew, reflexively as a businessman, pulled out his wallet and offered him some cash. But the boy stepped back, smiled, and said, "Thank you, sir. But I don't need anything. Just happy to help." That was the moment everything changed. Not because Matthew had been helped, but because, for the first time in a very long while, he was reminded of something he'd forgotten. True kindness doesn't come with a contract. Sometimes, the ones we think have nothing, end up giving us the most. Not in material form, but in the way they reach something deep within us, kindness. And from that very moment, Matthew began to wonder who the boy was. Not out of obligation, but because of something deeper. Something he couldn't quite name. And that's where the journey to find Elijah began. The boy's name was Elijah. Matthew didn't know that at the time. He didn't know his name, his age, or where he was from. All he saw was a skinny boy with clear, bright eyes like someone who had just stepped out of a modern fairy tale. Elijah didn't look like a hero. He didn't wear a cape. He didn't have expensive shoes. He wore old sneakers, a faded t-shirt, and hands covered in road dust. And yet in those small hands was something Matthew couldn't buy. Unconditional kindness. Elijah didn't ask who Matthew was, how much money he had, or where he lived. He didn't take a video. He didn't post it online. He didn't even wait for a thank you. He simply helped because he felt it needed to be done. And maybe, what moved Matthew wasn't the action itself, but the way Elijah did it. Naturally. Comfortably. As if kindness was the most obvious thing in the world. In a society where helping someone often comes with "what's in it for me?" Elijah felt like an exception, quiet, gentle, but unforgettable. Elijah's story isn't the only one of its kind. All over the world, there are people like him. Doing good and moving on, leaving no trace. An anonymous person paid for a young couple's dinner in Texas, then disappeared before they could say thank you. A bus driver in New Jersey pulled over on the highway just to help an elderly woman tie her shoelace. But the difference was, Matthew had never encountered something like this personally. And once it happened, he couldn't look away. Elijah didn't just fix a flat tire. He touched something deep inside Matthew. A part that had been gathering dust for far too long. Faith in strangers. Trust in goodness. And the peace that comes from an unnamed act. It doesn't take grand gestures to create big changes. Sometimes, just a small hand helping you on the roadside is enough to awaken a sleeping heart. As Elijah walked away, Matthew couldn't take his eyes off that small figure. Partly out of gratitude, partly out of curiosity, and partly because he saw in the boy a reflection of who he once was. Before he forgot what truly mattered. And so, the next morning, he got into his car. Not to go to the golf course, or a board meeting. But to find a boy named Elijah, and maybe, to find himself again. That night, in his 6,000 square foot mansion, Matthew didn't turn on the TV. He sat in an old leather chair, the only piece of furniture he'd kept from when he was poor, staring into a half-full glass of scotch. Dinner, a fine steak cooked by his private chef, sat untouched on the table, going cold. In his mind was one single image, Elijah's smile. A calm smile, simple and unconditional. A smile that made him feel small, amid all the things he once thought were great. Matthew had met many people. Successful business people who calculated every step. Politicians who shook hands while thinking about their next meeting. Partners in Armani suits, but whose eyes lacked sincerity. But Elijah, a 13-year-old boy, did one simple thing. And made Matthew feel humble for the first time in decades. In that silence, Matthew clearly felt an emptiness. Not from lacking money or power. But from realizing, for all those years, his wallet was full but his heart was empty. This is a psychological phenomenon many have experienced. It's called the success paradox. the more successful you become. The more you feel disconnected. You may have everything. Except one thing, genuine simplicity and connection. Matthew used to think people helped each other for personal gain. To climb the ladder. To expand their network. To be tagged in a post. But Elijah didn't want anything. And that's exactly what made Matthew want to give everything. A truly humble person doesn't make you feel they are smaller. They make you realize how much larger you've become. And then, a thought crept into his mind. Soft as a breeze through a window frame. If there are still people like Elijah in this world, then I still have something to do. The next morning, Matthew woke up early. No suit. No tie. He drove himself. No driver. No meetings. Just one journey, led by his heart. To find Elijah. And maybe, find his younger self again. That morning, Matthew didn't make coffee using his automatic machine like he usually did. He buttoned up a simple shirt, chose an old pair of shoes, the same shoes he wore on his first hiking trip with his father. No suit. No chauffeur. No schedule. Just a small map, a few scribbled notes, and one name, Elijah. No one told him he had to do this. He wasn't even sure what exactly he was searching for. The boy had left no phone number. Hadn't asked for anything. Left no trace. Just walked away, like a passing breeze. But Matthew's heart was restless. He felt that if he didn't go he would miss something deeply important. Not to repay a favor, but to continue an invisible thread. The kind that connects people through simple acts of kindness. And so, he went. Down the same country road where his tire had gone flat the day before. Matthew stopped by every small shop he came across. A general store with a jingling bell at the door. An old gas station on the edge of town. A quiet cafe where an elderly lady was wiping the counter. I'm looking for a boy, he told each person the same way. About 13 years old, wearing a faded shirt, he helped me change a tire near here yesterday. Most shook their heads. A few just shrugged. Until the cafe owner smiled and said, "You must be talking about Elijah. He lives with his mother in Harlan. That boy, he's a good one. Everyone loves him." Harlan. The name sounded both familiar and distant. A small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. Where people still knew their neighbors' names. And where kindness was still second nature. On the drive to Harlan, Matthew didn't turn on the radio. No podcast. He let the wind pass through the window, the sound of the engine blend with his thoughts. The closer he got, the clearer it became. He wasn't just looking for Elijah. He was looking for a part of himself that had long been asleep. The part that once trusted strangers. That once gave freely. That once acted without calculating. In today's fast-paced world, we're often reminded. Time is money. But perhaps, something is worth more than money. Presence. And there are people, like Elijah, who give their time to others. Not because they have to. But because they want to. There are people who pass through our lives only once. But leave a mark forever. And if we don't pause to learn who they are, we may miss something beautiful for the rest of our lives. When Matthew arrived, Harlan welcomed him with quiet streets, curved wooden porches, and birdsong in the backyard. No glamour. No neon lights. Just a place that felt real. He walked slowly past each house, asking the people he met. Until, an old lady pointed toward the end of the street. That house, with the red roof. I think you've found who you're looking for. And there it was. A small house, its red shingles faded by the sun. Wooden steps slightly worn with time. On the porch, a few pairs of old shoes neatly arranged. And by the window, a bougainvillea struggling to bloom its last flowers of the season. Matthew stood there, silently. He didn't feel the awkwardness of a stranger, but a deep sense of reverence, as if he were about to step into a place that guarded something sacred. He knocked on the door. A woman in her 40s answered. Her face tanned from the sun, her eyes firm but kind. She looked at him with a bit of surprise, and then slowly asked, "Can I help you, sir?" "Good morning," Matthew replied, pausing for a moment. "I believe I met your son yesterday. His name is Elijah. He helped me on the road and didn't ask for a thing. And I just wanted to say thank you." Her face softened immediately. She smiled a simple smile, warm like early autumn sunlight. "Yes, that must be my Elijah. He's always been that way, helping people without being told." Matthew was invited inside. There were no luxurious furnishings. No crystal chandeliers. No framed art. Just an old sofa set, some family photos. And a feeling that said, "This is home." He sat down, his eyes wandering across a wall full of hand-drawn pictures. Trees, suns, and crayon-scrawled words like Mom. They weren't fine art, but they made the room warmer than any gallery he'd ever visited. And then Matthew understood. This was where Elijah had grown up. A place not rich in money, but full of love. A place that taught a boy helping others was normal. No cameras needed. No rewards expected. People often say, children reflect the environment they grow up in. And if Elijah had learned to give so early, then this house, this mother, was where the seed had been planted. Harlan was like that. A small town, where people still knew each other's names. Where neighbors still knocked on doors if someone's lights weren't on at night. Where eat what we have wasn't a sign of poverty, but a way of saying, what's mine is ours. In towns like Harlan, people still hold community potlucks. Everyone brings a dish and adds it to a shared table. No one asks what others brought. As long as you come with heart, you have a seat. Some places may not shine bright, but they're warm enough. Some homes may be small, but they hold enough love to raise a beautiful heart. When Elijah came in from the backyard, Matthew stood up. The boy was just as simple as the day before. But this time, Matthew saw more clearly. He wasn't just the kid who changed his tire. He was the product of a quiet, humble community. Like Harlan. Like his mother. Like the part of America that the cities had started to forget. And when Elijah smiled and asked, "You came back because of the flat tire?" Matthew gently shook his head. "No. Because of you. And because of what you reminded me of. Would you stay for dinner with us?" His mother smiled, her voice soft like a morning greeting. Matthew hesitated. Not because of his schedule, but because he wasn't used to being invited without conditions. In his world, invitations came with memberships, dress codes, and guest lists. But here, it was just a small wooden table, a few mismatched chairs, and the faint smell of freshly baked bread from the kitchen. "It would be an honor," he said, and stepped inside. The kitchen was filled with the warm glow of the afternoon sun. On the table were simple dishes. A small pot of stew, crispy toasted bread, steamed vegetables, and a plate of fruit. No imported items. No expensive wine. Just sincerity, served alongside the meal. Matthew sat between mother and son. At first, he felt out of place. White dress shirt, polished leather shoes. And the demeanor of a man who had been using silverware since he was 30. But then, Elijah began to talk about school. About the neighbor's dog, Max, who always barked like crazy in the mornings. About his dream of becoming an engineer. "So I can fix not just cars, but houses, bridges, and this whole town." Matthew laughed an honest laugh. Not forced, not out of politeness. It had been a long time since he felt part of something so real. People often confuse excess with abundance. Matthew's home had 2 chefs, a private wine cellar, and 7-course dinners served in silence. But here, every story, every laugh, every exchanged glance was soul food he hadn't tasted in years. According to a study by Harvard, people who have close relationships and regularly share meals with loved ones have significantly higher happiness and mental well-being, even if they earn less money. Matthew looked at the mother, smiling as Elijah shared a story about getting a B+ in math. He saw no disappointment, no burden, just the gentle pride of a mother. Not because her son was the best, but because he had dreams and knew how to give. Some humble tables can raise entire character. And sometimes, what we truly need isn't on the plate, but in the eyes of the person sitting across from us. After dinner, they cleaned up together. No one had to ask. No one gave orders. Everyone simply did their part. Like a silent symphony of belonging. Matthew stood by the sink, receiving a dish towel from Elijah. "You wash, I'll dry, okay." He nodded. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel like the chairman of the board, but just a man, living something real. As the afternoon faded, Matthew stepped out to the porch. Looking at the modest house glowing in the golden light of sunset, he knew he couldn't leave with just a thank you. Not because Elijah needed something, but because he himself needed to do something. To repay a debt money couldn't cover. Matthew left Elijah's home that evening with a strange feeling. Not a fleeting sense of emotion. Not satisfaction like one feels after charity. Something deeper. A desire to be present. Not just as the one who received a lesson, but as someone who would carry it forward. That night, in his familiar mansion, Matthew opened an old address book. For the first time in years, he made phone calls. Not to plan investments, but to ask who could help renovate a house in a town called Harlan. Within a few days, the plan was in motion. A crew from Lexington was ready to come. Materials were shipped from a supplier over the mountains. Matthew personally sketched the renovation plan with an old friend who used to be an architect. And then, one morning, the sound of trucks filled the air in front of Elijah's house. The boy ran out into the yard. His mother stood frozen in disbelief. New lumber, paint, insulation materials. Men in hard hats carrying ladders, drills, and paint buckets. "You didn't have to do this," Elijah whispered. His mother teared up, speechless. Matthew simply smiled, clipboard in hand. Wearing a sun hat like a true construction manager. "Not because I have to. Not because you asked. But because, someone who once helped without expecting anything, deserves to receive with all the respect in the world." He didn't just hire workers and disappear. Matthew stayed. He ate lunch with the crew, carried wood, wiped sweat. Stood on the porch pointing out each detail. He understood. If kindness is a seed, then presence is the best way to water it. In the US, many programs like Habitat for Humanity operate with the philosophy of build with, not for. Meaning, to build with communities, not just for them. That's how connection is created, not pity. Elijah, despite being told to rest, was always around the site. Asking technical questions. Wanting to learn how to measure and build. A large, quiet man named Joe, one of the workers, began teaching him how to use a tape measure. How to check for right angles. How to tell different types of wood apart. Matthew watched from a distance, his heart unexpectedly warm. He wasn't just fixing a house. He was watching a boy begin to dream about a future. With eyes that sparkled. Some forms of help don't create dependency. They open a door for new dreams to walk through. Over the next few weeks, the house transformed day by day. The porch was reinforced. The interior was painted in warm colors. A new shelf was added to the kitchen. And in the backyard a small swing made from salvaged steel was built. Nothing too expensive. But every detail crafted with respect, not pity. When the work was nearly done, Matthew sat on the porch steps, Elijah beside him. The boy looked up, eyes distant. "I never thought this house could look like this." Matthew chuckled softly. "I never thought I'd want to stay here this long either." Elijah had always been curious. From the day the first workers arrived to fix the house, he couldn't hide the excitement in his eyes every time he saw someone hammering, measuring, sawing wood, or assembling anything. At first, he just sat on the porch watching silently. But soon enough, his small hands began helping. Holding the measuring tape, picking up fallen screws, handing the workers cool drinks during the midday heat. Joe, the large, quiet, steady worker, was the first to notice. One afternoon, as everyone took a break, Joe handed Elijah a tape measure and said, "Kid, measure this piece of wood for me, will you?" Elijah did it accurate to the inch. Joe nodded. He said nothing more, but from that day on, Elijah became the team's little right hand. And Matthew, watching from a distance, witnessed the quiet miracle taking place. No classroom. No projector. Just a real teacher, a real learner. And a safe space where a child could make mistakes, then try again. In the US, they call these moments spark moments. The instant a flame of passion is lit. It doesn't have to be flashy. You don't need to immediately know what you want to do for the rest of your life. You just need one moment where your heart beats faster. And that's enough. Elijah started asking more questions. How do you know this roof is strong enough? Why use pine instead of oak? If I want to build a house one day, what do I need to learn? Matthew had heard hundreds of questions in boardrooms. But none had made him this happy. According to the National Mentoring Partnership, teens who are introduced to careers early through hands-on mentorship are twice as likely to pursue higher education, and 3 times more likely to find a job they truly love. And so Matthew decided to do one more thing. Not just renovate a house. He went to the nearest high school, met with the principal, and offered to fund a small STEM program for students who wanted to explore engineering. Starting with Elijah. Not to help, but to ignite. Not to give what Elijah lacked, but to nurture what he already had. Sometimes, you don't need to be a teacher, an inventor, or an expert. You just need to be the one holding the match, and offer it to someone when they begin to feel a fire inside. One late afternoon, when everyone had gone home, Elijah sat on the porch of the newly renovated house. In his hand, the first blueprint he ever sketched. A small house with a sturdy roof and windows facing the mountains. Matthew sat beside him, quietly observing. "You know," he said, "you're building something far bigger than just this roof." Elijah looked up, his eyes glowing with hope. "Really?" Matthew nodded. "Really? Because what you're learning isn't just about building a house. It's about building a future. For yourself. And maybe, for others too." It all started with a flat tire. An unnamed act, with no expectation of return. A boy who simply bent down to help, and then quietly walked away. But like a small stone dropped into a pond, the ripples began to spread gently, but far. After the house was rebuilt, something magical began to happen. Not loud. Not dramatic. But real. Very real. To his neighbors for the first time in years. A group of local high school students, inspired by Elijah's story, began volunteering to clean up the town's playground every weekend. The local school launched a community engineering club, with more students joining than expected. and Elijah as their inspiration. At the cafe where Matthew had once stopped to ask about Elijah, a small wooden sign was hung beside the register. If you received something good today, help the next person. This is a real sociological principle called contagious generosity, the idea that kindness is contagious. Research shows that one act of kindness not only affects the person helped, but increases the likelihood that 2 to 3 others will pass it on. Not out of obligation, but because their sense of humanity is awakened. And in Harlan, people began sharing Elijah's story as proof that belief in goodness was making a quiet return. If a 13-year-old boy can change how people treat each other, why can't we? As for Matthew, he continued returning to Harlan, not to help, but to feel real again. To return to something the luxury of the city could never buy. He was no longer the stranger in the fancy car. Now, he was Uncle Matthew, the man who always carried rulers, blueprints, and stories to share. One small act of kindness, no matter how minor, can plant hope in a place you never expected. And if you're humble enough to truly listen, you'll realize the ones you thought you were helping might be the ones healing you. One late afternoon, as the golden sunlight covered the roof of the new house, Elijah sat on the backyard swing, now sturdy and brand new. Matthew stood nearby, holding a glass of iced tea, silently watching. The boy turned to look at him, eyes just as clear as the day they met. "Did you think it would go this far?" Elijah asked. Matthew smiled gently, shaking his head. "I just thought, you were helping me with a flat tire. The rest, you're the one who set in motion." Matthew Evans once had everything. At least, on paper. $1 million investment portfolio. A glass-walled mansion overlooking the ocean. Parties where everyone smiled. But their eyes were distant. But then, a nameless boy, from a forgotten town few could even find on a map, gave him what he'd been searching for his whole life. True connection. A reason to live. And a sense of peace that came from within. On paper, Matthew was the one who gave so much. He paid for the house repairs, funded scholarships, established a community support fund. But if you asked him truthfully, he was the one who received the most. A 75-year Harvard study revealed that what brings the most happiness and longevity to people isn't money or fame. It's deep, quality relationships and genuine emotional connection. Matthew had once embodied the first half. Now, he lived out the second. On a quiet Sunday morning, Matthew sat on the porch of Elijah's new home, in a wooden chair handcrafted by the boy himself, using leftover planks from the house renovation. Elijah sat beside him, holding a sketchbook filled with blueprints of houses, buildings, and bridges he dreamed of building someday. "Do you regret it?" Elijah asked. "Leaving everything in the city, to do all this?" Matthew paused, then gently shook his head, his voice low and warm. "I didn't leave, Elijah. I just started again. In a place worth starting. There are lessons in life that take a lifetime to learn. Not because they're hard, but because we're too busy to hear them. And when we finally slow down, when we're awake enough to observe, humble enough to listen, we realize the most precious things in life aren't locked in vaults. They're found in every moment lived with gratitude and presence. Human connection can't be bought. Trust can't be bought. But if you live truthfully enough, give deeply enough, then you'll receive more than any asset can offer. Matthew was no longer the Matthew of spreadsheets and boardrooms. He was the man the kids of Harlan ran to with their drawings. The one invited to dinner not for his title, but for how he listened. The man who understood that a flat tire might just be life's way of making you stop long enough to step into a more important journey. And Elijah. He was no longer just the boy who fixed the tire. He was growing up with a dream of building. Not just with bricks and beams, but with trust and kindness. This was the beginning of a ripple effect, where each person helps the next. Not out of duty, but because their heart says so. The beginning of a world, where strangers don't just pass each other by, but leave a mark. And if you've ever felt alone in a crowd, if you've ever thought kindness was outdated, then remember, every change, every connection, every miracle, can begin with a single, simple act. Nameless, priceless, but powerful enough to touch the heart,